All right, so continuing with this paper we were doing. 21, what is likely to be the effect on interest rates and money supply of a purchase of government securities by a central bank? Now, I know a lot of you have just memorized that when government sells securities, money supply decreases, but be a little careful to whom it's selling its securities to. That happens if it sells it to the non-bank private sector, to households basically. Here, look at it like this: you have your central bank, you have your government. The government is giving the central bank securities. In return, the central bank will give the government, well, money because it's buying the securities. Government gets money, most probably the government will start to spend it inside the economy, so government expenditure will go up, which clearly means the money supply will go up. Um, Again, the only options were increase or decrease in money supply. So if the government is getting more money from the central bank, clearly the money supply will increase as it will spend that money. Now, what you should already know that when money supply goes up, interest rates follow an inverse relationship. So interest rates go down. If you're confused with this, just draw your liquidity preference curve and shift the money supply rightwards there, and you will clearly see a decrease in interest rates. Um, 22, the table shows the figures for consumption, capital formation, and depreciation in 4 economies, all measured in US dollars. Um, Assuming that the state of technology remains unchanged, which economy is most likely to experience economic growth? So economic growth will come about by, by well, not, let me not call it capital, like let me call it the amount of net capital you have. Consumption won't really affect you that much because that's just I mean, that's like you consumed. It might have some actual growth benefits, but not really potential growth. That will come about by capital, but you have to look at net capital, which is the capital formed minus the capital that was that basically depreciated. So the capital that was that is now obsolete, that's not no longer being used. So here the net capital is minus 10, so clearly not this. Here it is 100, so maybe this. Here it is minus 200. Here it is minus 1000. So in fact, C and D, all where you have a net capital of negative, clearly means you have negative net investment. I mean that obviously wouldn't help you achieve economic growth. Might go the other way around. But here you have a positive net capital, which means more capital is being formed than it is being worn out. So you should have growth, economic growth, including potential growth. 23, GDP per head is an indicator sometimes used to compare living standards of various countries. GDP is converted into a common currency at market exchange rates. What might cause this indicator to exaggerate the relative position of an individual country? So to basically overstate it, that's the idea. A high level of female participation. Well, that's not really included in the indicator. A high level of foreign ownership in domestic industry, and I believe that what you call it to exaggerate. With to exaggerate is basically to overstate, so that let's say your level was this, and this is the level that your GDP is say. So it's exaggerated. It's not actually that high. And that could work because if foreigners have a high level of ownership in your domestic industry, the GDP would just include that output in your calculation, and it would be like, oh, it's so high, when in reality it's not yours. It's owned by foreigners, and they're going to take the dividends and all of it. If it had been GNP, then this problem wouldn't have been there. But with GDP, it doesn't really account for net income flows from abroad. A high level of but if it is a high level of subsistence farming, which means your GDP is understated, in fact, because then all of that isn't included, which means this was the level, your actual level, the GDP stated this level, so that's understated. That's not what you want.
Subsistence farming आती नहीं है.
Sorry?
Subsistence farming is when you're not paying for it, it's बनाया और खुद ही consume कर लिया. So it won't be calculated anyway in GDP.
But in reality, it helps with standard of living. The GDP unfortunately doesn't look at calculated. So I'm saying here the GDP would be understated from what it actually should be if it was like, if you look at that's what I'm saying. So in reality, you were like, let's say at point A in terms of living standards, the GDP said no, you are as low as point B because it didn't include this stuff in its own calculations. So that is understatement, an understatement, not really what you want, which is an overstatement. Relatively low hours worked by the labor force. If there are low hours worked, you would probably have a low GDP, but that doesn't mean it's been overstated. That just means it's the same as what it should be. So like there's no exaggeration there. In the absence of offsetting changes, what will result in an increase in the government's fiscal deficit. So the fiscal deficit again was your tax revenue minus your government expenditure. So you want to increase this, which means you want to make this more negative in a way, the deficit. So you want tax revenue to either decrease or government expenditure to increase so that it goes even more into a deficit. A decrease in household savings. If people are saving less, they're probably going to be consuming more, which means their tax revenue would be more. So not that. A decrease in interest rates on government bonds. So if so, these are interest rates that are separate, that are on bonds. So don't confuse them with normal interest rates. So if that happens, those rates go down. People would save less, and I think the same idea applies. They wouldn't buy bonds. They would either keep their money in the yes.
पार्ट ए, अगर तुमने वो बोल रहे हैं कि फिस्कल डेफिसिट बढ़े, मतलब तो टैक्स रेवेन्यू ज्यादा होगा, गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग कम नहीं होगी.
I think they're saying fiscal deficit बढ़े.
हाँ.
Expenditure ज़्यादा होगा, revenue कम.
That the deficit increases, not.
I'm sorry. Okay, I get it.
It's okay. You have been forgiven. Anyhow, so yeah. So if government bonds aren't that attractive, either two things can happen. Either they'll be like, okay, forget the government bonds. We'll just go and save it in the banking sector. In that, there really shouldn't be any difference on the fiscal deficit. Or they can be like, let's not save in the bonds at all. We'll just consume. And obviously that kind of has the same thing as this did. So that would just reduce the deficit, not increase it. A decrease in the private sector investment. So a decrease in private sector investment, what does that do? If there's less investment, there's basically less economic activity. Can we say your tax revenue goes down here? Because you have stuff like corporation tax and so on.
Also like because private sector investment नहीं होगा, तो there might not be new firms जिसके ऐसे और tax तो आएगा ही, existing level पे रहेगा, expenditure शायद बढ़ भी जाए क्योंकि consumption level कम हो जाएंगे, growth कम होगी, potential.
Yeah. So as you go towards, so this will basically pull you towards a recession. This would have deflationary pressures, and as you move towards a recession, your tax revenue decreases because there's less economic activity. And if you really want to be extreme here, your government expenditure, if you really go towards a recession, might also increase because then you have stuff like more expenditure on unemployment benefits and stuff of that sort. Anyhow, but let's look at a decrease in the country's trade deficit, which basically means a decrease in the trade deficit. So that means exports are being sold more as they were before. Imports are being sold less as they were before. Now, if exports are being sold more, that normally indicates like economic activity. So which means your tax revenue from here should increase. However, Shailen, what's interesting though is if your imports are being sold less, okay, do we include the effect of tariffs here?
I don't think so. मेरे हिसाब से like D should be wrong because like deficit कम होगा, so we generally assuming कि तुम्हारा export revenue बढ़ रहा है.
Yeah. Okay. So generally, so one might be confused with the idea that okay, your tariffs would earn less because imports are decreasing. But the idea is because if your exports increase, your overall economy is stimulated in such a manner because now they're working to what do you say, to produce these exports. So because of that, you have tax revenue. Another way to look at this is because this will increase aggregate demand as you move towards a surplus, and because of that, stuff like consumption and all will increase, which also leads to increases in tax revenue, which is not what you want. 25, an economy is operating at its natural rate, so at Nehru, or according to monetarist theory, what will be the effect on unemployment in the short run and in the long run of an unanticipated increase in the money supply? So if the money supply increases, that leads to monetary demand pull inflation, so aggregate demand increases. We know that. Now, if you look at the monetarist Phillips curve. So this is your unemployment percentage. This is your price level, the percentage of that, and this is your short run Phillips curve. So the idea here is you were here before, let's say at point A, because aggregate demand increased, you went at this point. So you successfully managed to reduce unemployment in the short run. So in the short run, unemployment should reduce. However, the issue is in the long run, what happens? You always return back to the same level because of changing in expectations, and stuff of that sort. So you return back to this level. You'd have a higher price level, so you'd have greater inflation, but you'd have the same level of unemployment because you cannot change the natural rate of unemployment through demand management policies. You can only do so through supply side policies. So in the long run, there'd be no change, giving you C. What are likely to be the impacts on the economy of increased competition from abroad? Okay, so if there's increased competition from abroad, so the impact on the trade balance, I believe that should worsen, right? Because
Um,
if there's increased competition, it's going to be a little difficult to sell your exports. And at the same time, a lot of people might start importing because, well, now they have a lot of substitutes a lot of very nice substitutes to what domestic producers are producing. So you could say that that worsens. Impact on rate of inflation. Now, if your trade balance is worsening, I would say that reduces the threat of demand pull inflation. And if it reduces the threat of demand pull inflation, it should increase the impact on the unemployment rate, because if there's, let's say, this leads to less aggregate demand, and because of that, your price level goes down, but your employment also goes down, which means your unemployment goes up, which basically is why we take an increase for unemployment. That you can give that the answer of D. Which method of financing an increase in government expenditure is likely to have the greatest expansionary effect? So if you increase taxes, these have, whichever tax you're increasing, this has a contractionary effect. So you can just cross that out right there. I would say it's borrowing from the central bank, because if you borrow from the non-banking private sector, you're going to do so by selling them bonds and securities and so on. And the effect that has, that because of this, because of government expenditure, money supply increases, but because you're borrowing from the non-bank private sector, money supply decreases. So your overall effect of money supply is like a little uncertain. You want the greatest expansionary effect, so you want the money supply to increase as much as possible, right? So that monetary demand pull inflation, all that type of stuff. So aggregate demand increases the most, and you can do so by borrowing from the central bank, because you'll give them securities, but they'd give you cash, and then you can just spend that. So money supply would increase. 28, the table shows how the government finances its budget deficit in a closed economy. So it does, the deficit was this much. Central banks, it takes 550 from central bank and 150 from sale of sale of government securities to the non-bank private sector, so to households and so on. If there's no change in notes and coins in circulation, and commercial banks maintain a 10% cash reserve ratio, so that's basically your liquidity ratio, what will be the resulting increase in money supply? So if you look,
multiplier.
I think you first need to calculate your credit multiplier. Your
Correct.
credit multiplier was one upon your liquidity ratio, which is basically how much of a deposit you would keep in cash, which is basically your cash reserve ratio. So 1 upon
Point
10% would
one.
be 10 upon 100, which is, yeah, zero point 0.1, which
So
means this
10.
would be 10. Now, if you look at the overall increase in money supply, so if you sell to the non-bank private sector, well, that doesn't increase your money supply, but if you sell to the central bank, that does. So your money supply should increase by 50, and the reason is because, well, the deficit is 200, right? So you're already kind of in a way in through this, you're kind of already increasing money supply by 200. uh, if you sell to the central bank 50, this doesn't reduce your money supply. However, if you sell to the non-bank private sector, this would reduce your money supply by 150. um, so, well, whoops, a little messy, but because of that, 200 minus 150 would give you an overall increase of 50. 50 into 10 gives you 500. What is likely to be the effect on developing economies of an inward foreign direct investment? This is a very common question. So the idea here is, when foreign direct investments come in, that's in fact a very popular way to grow, to develop. So it does accelerate the technology transfer, because obviously if they're investing inside your economy, the idea here is they're also bringing some of their technology, some of their ways to do stuff, some of their production mechanisms and methods, and that helps to teach your local population how to produce in a more efficient manner, helps bring in that technology and so on. It does not increase debt. It just has no effect on trade deficits, and it should not slow down rural urban migration, because a lot of this investment is in urban areas. So in fact, if anything, urban areas are more attractive now, so you would want to go to migrate, you want to migrate to urban areas more, if anything would happen. Economists have proposed that the best policy to promote development is trade, not aid. What is implied by this proposal? That developing countries should become self-sufficient. I believe one could say so, because on aid, you're still dependent on someone else paying for you, right? Kind of like the idea of how you give a man some fish, you fed him for a weekend, but if you teach him how to fish, well, now he's self-sufficient, and now he doesn't have to rely on you. Anyhow, developing countries should be given greater access to markets in developed countries. Um, well, that's something that you can say. Let's just look at the other options as well. Developing countries should use foreign aid to invest in their export industries. Well, not really. They said they shouldn't. You shouldn't use aid at all. You should use trade instead of aid. Developing countries should use trade barriers to promote import substitution. No, when they what they mean by aid is to develop through globalization and trade liberalization, not to close off. So guys, what
Ankit,
do you?
it should be B, because like trade not aid is more specifically pointing out that they should be given these advantages, because इस तरह के aid में usually what happens is कि like the developed countries have some benefit to themselves now, would say.
Yeah, so you're saying that it should be B because, well, um, if they have greater access to markets in developed countries, then they can trade. And A is a little vague. Bilal, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can hence conclude with your answer of B, not A, because A is a little vague. Well, yes, in a way, you can say that developing countries through trade and all will become, but there's another way to look at this. In fact, if you maybe you can also cross out A, but one logic is A is a little vague, B is more specific to what they said. The second reason is because if they're relying on trade, they're still not in a way self-sufficient, right? Being self-sufficient would be like going North Korea. Um, does that make sense?
Hmm.
Yeah, so self-sufficiency might come across if you diversify and isolate yourself rather than focusing on your comparative advantage and promoting trade. So which is also why you can cross out A. So with that, we'll just quickly check our answers.